Good evening. I'm Kevin Guskowitz, a Chancellor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and welcome to the Spring 2021 Frey Foundation Distinguished Visiting Professor Lecture. This lecture is one of the highest honors bestowed by the College of Arts and Sciences at Carolina, bringing to campus renowned speakers from a variety of fields, including government, public policy, international affairs, and the arts. 2021 marks the 27th year of our Frey Lecture Series. I'd like to thank the Frey Foundation and David and Judy Frey for their support of the Frey Foundation Distinguished Visiting Professor Fund. I believe that David and Judy and other members of the Frey family are with us this evening. Thank you all for making this evening possible. I'd also like to thank Terry Rhodes, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. It's always been the intention of the Freys that this lecture be a gift to the community along with UNC students, faculty, and staff. If we were on campus, I'd be speaking to you from Memorial Hall with a capacity of about 1,400 people. But with this virtual event and our ability to reach Tar Heels all over the world, we're breaking previous Frey Foundation lecture attendance records with more than 2,300 people registered for this evening's event. I'm so excited to hear one of the leading literary scholars of our nation speaking about the historic events that have shaped our present. I also want to welcome the more than 500 students who are part of the Institute of African American Research's SLATE initiative. And in case you don't know, SLATE stands for Student Learning to Advance Truth and Equity. Now it's my honor to introduce our guest and our moderator. Henry Louis Gates Jr. is the Alphonse Fletcher University Professor and Director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. He's an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker, literary scholar, journalist, cultural critic, and institution builder. He's authored or co-authored more than 24 books and created 23 documentary films, including the popular PBS genealogy series, Finding Your Roots. One of the books that Dr. Gates co-edited was the Norton Anthology of African American Literature with UNC's own William Andrews, Professor Emeritus of English and Comparative Literature. His latest series, The Black Church, This Is Our Story, This Is Our Song, will air on PBS starting next week. Professor Gates is the recipient of more than 50 honorary degrees and far too many prizes to mention, so I'll just name a few. He was a member of the first class awarded the Genius Grants by the MacArthur Foundation in 1981. In 1998, he became the first African-American scholar to be awarded the National Humanities Medal. And he was named to Time's 25 Most Influential Americans in 1997. Dr. Gates earned his BA degree in English, Language, and Literature from Yale, and his MA and PhD in English Literature from Clare College at the University of Cambridge. Also, less than 2 weeks ago, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences announced that Professor Gates was the recipient of its award for humanistic studies. This marked only the 7th time since 1975 that the Academy has bestowed this award. Congratulations, Professor Gates, for this rare achievement. Tonight, he will discuss themes from his 2019 book, Stony the Road, Reconstruction, White Supremacy, and the Rise of Jim Crow. It's been described as a profound new rendering of the struggle by African Americans for equality after the Civil War and the violent counter-revolution that subjected them. Guiding our conversation tonight is our own Karla Slocum. Professor Slocum is the Thomas Willis Lambeth Distinguished Chair of Public Policy, Professor of Anthropology, and Director of the Institute of African American Research at UNC-Chapel Hill. Dr. Slocum specializes in studies of place, race, history, and Black rurality. She is the author of Free Trade and Freedom, Neoliberalism, Place and Nation in the Caribbean, and Black Towns, Black Futures, the enduring allure of a Black place in the American West. Most recently, Professor Slocum is the co-creator of a resource guide on the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. She is pursuing an interdisciplinary project called Mapping Black Towns to digitally visualize the story of U.S. Black settlements. I want to alert our viewers that you will have an opportunity to ask questions through the Zoom and Q&A function, and you can submit them at any time during the conversation. And we'll devote the last 15 minutes or so to answering as many questions as we can. So my thanks go out to Benita Ramsey of IAAR for monitoring the questions and relaying them to our speakers. And so now I'll turn it over to Karla. Again, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Chancellor Guskiewicz. I'm really delighted to be here as well. And Dr. Gates, welcome. It's great to be in conversation with you this evening. Before we begin our conversation with Professor Gates, we're going to share with you a clip from a documentary series, mini-series that aired on PBS. It's titled Reconstruction, America After the Civil War. And this clip is actually going to help provide some context for the conversation that we're going to have tonight. It's going to foreground some themes and topics that we'll be covering. So why don't we just roll the clip and then we'll come back for the conversation.
On the evening of June 17, 2015, a stranger walked into an historic Black church in Charleston, South Carolina, known as Mother Emanuel. He prayed with the Wednesday night Bible study group for almost an hour. Then, he opened fire.
We have 9 victims, and I do believe this was a hate crime.
Friends say the 21-year-old high school dropout was a loner, an unabashed racist with a deep hatred for Black people.
He just said, I have to do it. He said, you rape our women and you taking over our country.
The massacre in Charleston touched off not only a debate over the Confederate flag, but it touched off a debate all over the country. How did we get here? And why is this happening?
It was easy, I guess, to think of that as a singular horror. And it was convenient, I think, to think of it that way. Unless you really wanted to understand how this could happen. And then that meant that you had to get into the history.
Most of us know that our country fought a civil war in the 1860s. But less is known about what came afterward, the chaotic, exhilarating, and ultimately devastating period known as Reconstruction. If we're looking for the roots of the tragedy at Mother Emanuel, this is where we have to start.
The Reconstruction period is one of extraordinary excitement, a time when America could finally become that land of freedom that it had promised to be since the very beginning.
Black people actually sat in the House of Representatives and the Senate. Poor whites and Black people saw a common cause with one another.
You're seeing this opportunity and imagining that will only get better. And looking back, what we know is those Black folks had no idea of the cliff that they were heading towards.
We do not come here begging for our rights. We come here clothed in the garb of American citizenship. We come demanding our rights in the name of justice.
Richard Kane could capture an audience. I think all his years in the pulpit made him a really good speaker in the House. He stood up to the white supremacists who were basically calling him, inferior. And he said, look at me, I have 2 eyes, I have 2 ears, I have 2 hands, I have 2 feet. How are we different when it comes to our manhood?
I was amazed when I began to read the speeches of Black congressmen in that period. I mean, here are people who are arguing about what the laws of the nation will provide in terms of human rights, and have a sophisticated understanding of the underlying principles that make these freedoms necessary in a democratic society. The level of discourse was so far above the level of discourse in Congress today. It was shocking.
One of the most tragic aspects of Reconstruction is that the more African Americans achieve, the more they put their lives at risk.
I could hear the noise of the horses.
They Ku Klux my house.
They had on white gowns, masks on their faces.
75 men.
They were Ku Klux.
They tore her clothes off.
I was blindfolded. Cut me with knives.
They whipped me.
They whipped me.
Put a rope around my neck to hang me.
Southern Democrats used violence and terror tactics to disrupt Republican control and plot their return to power. They saw themselves as the redeemers of their states.
Violence is efficient, it's easy, it's fast, and you can often do it under the cover of night. Klan attacks become so pervasive because that's how widespread the fear of Black enfranchisement is.
The Klan is actually committing atrocities against everyone. They're attacking freedmen and white Southerners who were sympathetic to the Union cause and to the Republican Party.
To their eyes, emancipation was wrong. They are washing the South with blood to redeem it.
This isn't simply a question of trying to return to an earlier way of life. This is actually a political counter-revolution.
W.E.B. Du Bois summarized Reconstruction in one sentence. The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back again toward slavery. Yet African Americans had tasted freedom. They had begun to acquire land, build schools, and create social institutions of their own. And though the tide was turning, they refused to give up on the promise of Reconstruction. The propaganda campaign to rehabilitate the reputation of the South commenced almost as soon as the Civil War was over, with the publication of a book called The Lost Cause. The Lost Cause argued that the intentions of the Confederacy had been righteous and admirable, in spite of its military defeat. 30 years after the war, this idea took on a new life. The Lost Cause became the ideological justification for white supremacy.
Get to the 1890s. The Lost Cause became not about loss at all. It became a new kind of narrative about the victory over Reconstruction.
There's a kind of entire mythology associated with what Reconstruction was attempting to do, that it involved the subordination of the white population by the Black population, that the Reconstruction legislators were ignorant, venal, or worse, predatory.
The Dunning School, for example, named for a Columbia University professor who was hell-bent on proving the point that Black people were incapable of self-governance and that Reconstruction had been a big failure and a big fiasco.
It was all wrong. So it becomes this way of justifying and making a case for why you need Jim Crow.
The Jim Crow system isn't just a series of laws. It's a set of beliefs, philosophies, attitudes, and even stone monuments.
Confederate monuments were only one form of Lost Cause propaganda that spread across the South in the 1890s. Even more important was retelling and revising the story of slavery itself.
You get a proliferation now of images of slavery, which are more nostalgic. The lithograph printmakers publishing images of the old plantation with happy children, Black children playing, and an older guy playing a banjo.
There's an incredible romantic idea that during the Grand Old South, when African Americans were slaves, they were prosperous, they were happy, they were joyful, they had everything provided for them. In reality, it's a story that's very much grounded in rape and torture and exploitation. but became a story of familial love.
The happy slave, the bumbling simpleton, the dangerous predator. Racist stereotypes of African Americans came in all shapes and sizes and in vivid color. Newly developed mass printing techniques meant that an unprecedented number of demeaning images of Black people could saturate American popular culture.
The architects of Jim Crow used popular culture and in cartoons all over magazines.
By 1915, with propaganda like the birth of a nation now accepted as historical fact, Black people had little hope for equal rights. Their moment in the sun had long passed, and the shadows were growing longer. But they never abandoned the hope that burned brightly in the earliest years of their emancipation.
If you say Reconstruction was an attempt to remake American society on the basis of equality, well, it didn't succeed in the long term, but it's very important to look at the agency of slaves, men, women, who seized the opportunity presented by the Civil War to push forward their own aspirations.
It's African Americans and radical whites who imagine a different sort of world, who make the high-minded arguments for citizenship, for civil rights, for democracy.
People like Ida B. Wells, W.E.B. Du Bois, Frederick Douglass knew that they were talented and fully the equal of whites, and they just could not accept this sort of second-class citizenship, and each generation would kind of come to this conclusion again and again, and they would keep on fighting.
I think once we've tasted freedom, once we've experienced freedom, once we've been able to see our agency actually create schools and laws, it drives a constant willingness to continue to sacrifice, to continue to agitate, to continue to demand that which you have experienced. When we look around the world today, we see dynamics and elements of inequality, and we need to have an explanation for it. If you don't know the history of Reconstruction, if you don't know what was tried and then dismantled, then your inference about why we still have these problems is it's a problem with the people. It's a problem with their work ethic, their family structure, their values, rather than it's a problem of an unfinished revolution, which Reconstruction was.
If we define Reconstruction as the process by which our country tried to come to terms with the abolition of slavery, you might say it never ended, because we Americans are still grappling with what it means to be a truly multiracial society with genuine equality for all.
Welcome again, everyone. That was very powerful. And again, Dr. Gates, thank you. It's wonderful to be here in conversation with you.
Thank you, Professor Slocum.
I would like to just dive right in. We don't have a lot of time, and there's so much that can be covered in this topic. What I appreciate about the film clip that we just viewed, and also about the book, Stony the Road, is that you really interweave the history with present day, with some dynamics from present day. And I think what I'd love to do today is kind of end up at where we are now and the implications of this Reconstruction era that you write about and that you've produced films about, that its implications for now. So let me just start with a question that asks you, thinking about this widespread and growing white supremacist ideology that you write about during the Reconstruction era, help us to understand the social and political dynamics of the Reconstruction era that helped actually give rise to the ubiquity of this white supremacist ideology?
Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank the Chancellor, Chancellor Guskowitz, for that wonderful introduction. He and I are in a rare fraternity of MacArthur Prize winners. So he's younger than I am, and he won more recently. It's a very special fraternity. And but thank you for your very generous words. And I'd like to thank the Frey family, the Frey Foundation. This is a great honor for me to be selected. I remember this is the first event I had to cancel when we shut down for COVID last March. And we looked at I think it was scheduled for May. I can't remember when, but I remember calling, and we shut down and sheltered in before UNC did, we at Harvard. And I remember I talked to a person on the phone, and she said, well, why can't you come? You know, and I said, well, because I don't want to die. And soon all the other universities were shutting down. But the only reason that I have to say, you know, to the Frey family and to the Chancellor, as great an academic and honor as it was, the real reason that I accepted was so I could come down for 2 days, one day eat at Mama Dip's, and the next day eat at Crook's Corner. And that was it. This was just an excuse. But I even
You'll have to
Googled
come
them.
back then.
You got a deal. I Googled them about an hour ago to see if they were still in business and to see if they delivered, but I don't think they delivered to Harvard Square. And I have to give one more set of shout outs. That's to my family. And Karla, you understand what that's like. If I didn't do it, I would be toast. The UNC is very much part of my family. My niece, Jennifer Gates Rogers, took a master's degree from UNC. And my nephew, Aaron Gates, took his bachelor's of science degree last year. And my brother Paul, who's a very distinguished oral surgeon, just retired from being the chief of dentistry at Bronx Lebanon Hospital and settled in Durham, where I lived when the 2 years when I was a professor at Duke. So shout out to the Gates tribe. And now I can put my cheat sheet away, and I won't get in trouble. But thank you very much. And your work sounds fascinating. And I want to talk to you about it. See, this is the kind of thing we'd be talking about at Crook's Corner if we weren't virtual. Reconstruction. I remember when I went in to pitch the idea to PBS. I have a long list of films that I want to make. And one is about the Great Migrations. The Black Church airs next week, which is, you know, I was on a Zoom call last night with religious leaders, 3,000, we even trended nationally, 3,000 religious leaders in the Black church talking about this film. But I really decided that I wanted to do Reconstruction about the middle of Barack Obama's first term. And it's because I was filming another series, and I was filming at Ferris State University in Michigan, and they have the world's only Jim Crow museum. And already there was a section of racist imagery about Barack Obama, and I'm talking about vile. I wouldn't even tell you they had dolls, and it was just disgusting. And I was so shocked because you will remember. Oh, by the way, is it okay if I call you Karla?
Absolutely.
And you can call me Skip if you want. That would be fine. Everybody else does. People don't know me. People write me every day. You remember when Barack Obama was elected, there were all these books by Black people saying this is the end of race. You know, racism is over. We have a Black man, and what it did, I tell my students at Harvard that there are two streams flowing constantly under the floorboards of Western culture. One is anti-Semitism, and one is anti-Black racism. And they are there all the time. I mean, there were pogroms against Jewish people in the 12th century, for example, and probably before that. And anti-Black racism just is part and parcel of the justification of the transatlantic slave trade, which shipped 12.5 million Africans across the Atlantic, 10.8 million of whom actually arrived. And Obama's election, rather than put an end to racism, awoke this slumbering beast of white supremacy. I mean, I had no idea of the vehemence that the presence of a Black person in the White House could provoke. And so I was thinking, when I started to see manifestation, when I left that Jim Crow Museum, I thought, oh my God, I have to tell the story. That there's a terrible thing that's coming. And then I wanted to tell it, as you said, in an historical way. So what would the precedent be? Okay, in a sentence, how would you describe Barack Obama's presidency? 8 years, one way would be 8 years of Black freedom, followed by an alt-right rollback, right? Well, Reconstruction was 12 years of Black freedom, followed by an alt-right rollback. It was a period that was glorious. The passage of the Constitution was reinvented. It was, the historians call it the second founding. Passage of the 13th Amendment, ratified on December 6, 1865. That ended slavery. Finally, we think that the Emancipation Proclamation did, but of course it didn't. The institution of slavery was ended by the ratification of the 13th. The 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, and establishing birthright citizenship. You ever wonder why we have one? But I think that there are, and students, you could fact check me on this, but I think there are 33 nations that have birthright citizenship. Why do we have birthright citizenship? Because they couldn't figure out how to make the people of African descent citizens after the Dred Scott decision of 1857, when the Supreme Court under Chief Justice Taney said that the founders never even thought about Black people in terms of citizenship. So they had to figure out, how do you make them citizens? So that is, a genius said, well, they were born here, right? And if you're born here, you have birthright citizenship. And then the 15th Amendment, which is ratified in April 1870, which gave Black men, because women couldn't vote, of course, the right to vote. And it was, it's called the second founding because it reinvented the Constitution in terms of the Equal Rights Clause and citizenship for Black people, the right to vote for people of color. So it was a tremendously exciting time. Between 1870 and 1877, 16 Black men are elected to Congress. And 3 of them were ministers, ironically. And overall, according to Eric Foner, 2,000 Black men were either elected to office or appointed to office during the Reconstruction period. 243 of those were ministers too, by the way. You see, I have the Black church on my mind. But all of that came crashing down with the Hayes-Tilden Compromise. And in 1877, the guarantees of the federal troops in certain remaining locales was taken away and reconstructed. It limped along. But really, the war over Reconstruction, and this is very important, it's a long-winded way of answering, but it is why white supremacy reared its ugly head. It had to do with the right to vote. We tend to forget that South Carolina, Mississippi, and Louisiana were majority Black states. And Georgia, Alabama, and Florida were almost majority Black states. So because of the Reconstruction Acts in 1867, Black men in the former Confederacy got the right to vote. Before, free Black men in the North got the right to vote through the 15th Amendment. And in the summer of 1867, which I call the first Freedom Summer, they registered to vote. 80% of the Black men in the former Confederacy actually registered to vote. And, there were big church meetings, and wives and sisters were, beating on his bed and saying, get up and register to vote. And in 1868, guess what? They voted. Ulysses S. Grant won the presidency overwhelmingly in the Electoral College, but he only won the popular vote by just over 300,000 votes. 500,000 Black men voted for Ulysses S. Grant. That was incredible. And most of these Black men, of course, had been formerly enslaved, and therefore most of them were illiterate. No one believed that Black men would take to the ballot, to the franchise, and with so much alacrity. And this represented a huge power threat. I mean, these was like a mini Black republic. Charles Blow, as you know, has a new book that Black people should move back to the South and reclaim their birthright. And Frederick Douglass and Richard T. Greener, the first Black man to graduate from Harvard in 1870, had a huge debate in 1879 over the exodusters. And as you well know, that was the first migration out of the South, when some of our ancestors, following Pap Singleton, moved to Arkansas and then to Kansas. So this was a tremendous power base, which in South Carolina had a majority House of Representatives, Speaker of the House, the state treasurer is Jim Clyburn, my good friend, says in the film. And this is what was most threatening to the former Confederacy. And I printed out, because I wanted to read this quote so that our students and our friends in the audience could realize how threatening the Black vote was. This is from Thomas Dixon's 1902 novel called The Leopard Spots. And it was, Dixon was like, in the history of racism, he would get the Nobel Prize for being a racist novelist. But it goes like this. It seemed a joke sometimes as he thought of it, and he's referring to Reconstruction. A huge preposterous joke, this actual attempt to reverse the order of nature, turn society upside down, and make a thick-lipped, flat-nosed Negro, but yesterday taken from the jungle, the ruler of the proudest and strongest race of men evolved in 2,000 years of history. Yet when he remembered the fierce passions in the hearts of the demagogues who were experimenting with this social dynamite, it was a joke that took on a hellish, sinister meaning. Simply because so long as the Negro is here with a ballot in his hands, he is a menace to civilization. The Republican Party replaced him here. The name Republican, for those students who don't know, Republican then, the Democrats and Republicans just flipped in terms of their attitudes about race. The name Republican will stink in the South for a century, he continues, not because they beat us in war, but because 2 years after the war, 1867, with the Reconstruction Acts, in profound peace, they inaugurated a second war on the unarmed people of the South. Their attempt to establish with the bayonet an African barbarism on the ruins of Southern society was a conspiracy against human progress. It was the blackest crime of the 19th century. End of quote. It was giving Black people the ballot. So they had to figure out how to take the ballot away. You can't just take away a constitutional amendment, right? So that created the war of white supremacy, a war of imagery, representing Black people as deracinated, meaning lacking reason, thieves, rapacious. Gus the rapist is the menacing figure in D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation, of course, and chicken thieves and liars and just, represented as being first cousin of the apes. So there was this huge propaganda war, but then the Mississippi Plan. And the Mississippi Plan was in 1890, the state of Mississippi had a constitutional convention and they rewrote the Constitution. And they never used the word race or Negro. What they did was to establish requirements for the right to vote, literacy laws, poll taxes. So the only people who could pass these literacy tests would be professors at the law school at UNC, right? I mean, white people would pass them automatically, but not Black people. So every Confederate state between 1890 and by the end of the first decade of the 20th century had rewritten their state constitution. And I'll tell you how effective that was in restricting the franchise. And of course, this was accompanied by Ku Klux Klan terror in the late 1860s, in the first wave of Ku Klux Klan, rape, violence. There were 8 major massacres between 1866 and 1876 throughout the South. We're familiar, of course, with the Wilmington coup, the Wilmington, North Carolina massacre at the end of the century. But to show you how effective voter suppression, disenfranchisement was, in Louisiana alone, in 1894, there were 130,000 Black men registered to vote. By 1904, after it had rewritten its state constitution, that number, Professor, had been reduced precisely to 1,342. Black people had, Black men in the South had the vote to give it to them and then take it away. And as you know, George White was the last Reconstruction congressman, and he made a farewell speech in 1901. And he said that the African-American people will rise one day again. And it took until 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act to get the right to vote restored for Black people throughout the South. And that's why John Lewis, my dear friend, whom I miss so much, that's why he was beaten so badly on Pettit's Bridge on Bloody Sunday, because it was the right to vote. And the right to vote is inextricably intertwined with economic power. So the rise of white supremacy is not just some idle mischief. It is about the anxiety of the scarcity of resources. And whenever people feel threatened, whether it's Christians being threatened by Jewish people, the Turks being threatened by Armenians, or white people in America being threatened, feeling threatened economically by Black people, some sort of racist or religious, anti-religious, in the case of Jews, mythology is called upon to suppress the people that you think are stealing the money that is causing your anxiety about inequality. So it is an economic phenomenon, it is a political phenomenon, it is a medium phenomenon. It's the first social media war, was the war over images of Black people, which Black people countered with the image of the new Negro, and as you know, we couldn't go out in public unless we were well-dressed. We had to show that we were civilized people. You know, Claude Steele, whom you know, the great psychologist at Stanford, once wrote an essay about who are the best dressed people at an airport. And at the time, this is 20 years ago, it was Black people. Why? Because you didn't want to be taken, you wanted to exemplify the politics of respectability, as Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham puts it. And that is all tied to the rise of white supremacy following Reconstruction.
Mm-hmm. You know, it's hard to hear you, it's hard not to think about what's going on today when we hear you describe what you've just described. Do you connect the dots between the fear of of power, of economic power among Black people? When I say that, I'm sorry, I don't want to have that be misinterpreted. What I'm saying is, do you connect the dots between what you described during the Reconstruction era and today, thinking about the uprising, the attack on the Capitol building on January 6th, and that coming out of a fear of a sense of Black people and others having power in our disproportionate power in our society, but also, you know, we know that those attacks were led by white supremacists. And here we are today, of course, with the second impeachment of Donald Trump, actually today, the hearings going on related to that event and charges of him inciting that event. So how do you connect the dots between those?
Absolutely. To me, this is, I created this film series and wrote the book to say, this is an analog for what is happening right now. Voter suppression. I mean, again, it was like for me, it was when I saw that wing of racist images of Barack. I mean, of Barack Obama. I mean, of all people, being represented like a monkey and an ape, and et cetera, et cetera. And then started to analyze ways that the Republican Party, frankly, was trying to suppress the vote in Black districts throughout the South, in Black districts or heavily represented Black districts, or gerrymandering, or voter ID, not making it easy to vote, making it harder to vote, not saying anybody with a driver's license has the right to vote, or mail-in ballots. All the machinations that we saw before the last election in attempts to suppress the vote. So that who is an American? Start with that. Look at the conservative policy on immigration. Who has the right to be an American? Who has the right to be a citizen? Who has the right to vote? Terrorist violence. What is the relationship between economic and political democracy? All those issues are Reconstruction issues, and they continue to roil our society and politics today, and they have their roots in Reconstruction. So we need, well, how do you deal with this? First of all, you don't demonize the other. When people are afraid, it's no good calling them names, right? I mean, we need leadership from the White House down that speaks to the fears of people. Look, it used to be, I remember when my brother and I were growing up, I loved a little 12-inch black and white TV, Leave It to Beaver. I wanted to grow up and have a house like Beaver Cleaver, his father wore a tie at dinner. His mother was always dressed. She didn't have to work. But we all believed that we were raised to believe that if we were good people, you were clean, orderly, you obeyed the law, you did your homework, they could grow up and go to dental school like my brother, or get a PhD like I did, go to the Ivy League, and that your children would go to college, and you could own a house, and you get a color TV, and maybe buy one car, and then maybe buy two, and that there was a rising curve of progress that was inevitable. But that ended, and the world changed profoundly economically. And one of the curve of rising expectations changed with the opening up of society and the economy to women and people of color in a more competitive way. And what am I referring to? I'm referring to affirmative action. And why is that important? It's important that we historicize what happened on January 6th. I show up at Yale in September 1969. Now, I'm one of 96 Black people to come to Yale that year. We're the affirmative action crossover class. Why do I say that? Because the class that graduated in 1966 at Yale had 6 Black men to graduate. What was there, a genetic blip in the race, and all of a sudden 90 smart Black people who were qualified to get into Yale who weren't in 1966? Of course not. Yale had a racist quota on the number of Black people. There were 6 in 66 and 6 in 65 and 6, that's all that they would let in. And they took that lid off and let us compete. It also was the first year that Yale admitted women. And there were 250 women and 1,000 men in the freshman class. And you know who was in my class? Sheila Jackson Lee, who's Congresswoman now. She has Barbara Jordan's seat from Houston. Kurt Schmoke, who's president of the university, but the first Black mayor of Baltimore. There was a nerdy pre-med guy. He didn't hang out that much. We used to party all weekend, all the Black people, so we could have soul music. One time we threatened that we were gonna protest if they didn't have soul food once a month. That was the concession that we wanted Yale to make to the presence of African-American culture. But we would relax and listen, and that was the golden age of soul, right? And this guy didn't really hang out And I'm telling a long-winded joke at his expense, but it was Ben Carson, right? Ben was in my class, and his wife Candy was in the class behind us. So we were all there, and we were the beginning of the diversification of American society at its upper economic levels. Since the terrible day when Dr. King was assassinated, the Black middle class has doubled and the Black upper middle class has quadrupled. Why? Because of affirmative action. And with other larger economic trends in the world that we don't have time to analyze, but which you and everyone else watching tonight understand, that inevitable rise in prosperity is just not that way anymore. We can't take it for granted. We need to retool education. It's a highly technological, digital world. The factory in Piedmont, in Luke, Maryland, which is across the bridge from Piedmont, where my father worked and where everybody else's father worked and some mothers worked, is never coming back. Paper mill, and people voted there for Donald Trump because he said that the mills were going to come back. Well, it's not going to come back, just like Beaver Cleaver's not going to come back. We need to retool our educational system. I think, frankly, Professor, frankly, I think one of the most radical things that could happen in this country is if the amount of money spent per child per district was nationalized. It was exactly the same. So that if you lived in Harvard Square or if you lived in Harlem, the amount of money spent per child was exactly the same. And Lawrence Tribe, the great constitutional scholar, told me the other day, and I haven't had a chance to research this, excuse me, told me that in the 50s, the Supreme Court came one vote away from making that the law of the land, that we would nationalize spending per child in our educational, public education, rather than making it local by and dependent upon taxes. So that creates huge inequalities in the amount of money spent per child. I also think that we need health care for every American. I think we need a guaranteed income. I think people need to have guaranteed jobs. I think raising the minimum wage to $15, it's just the beginning. It's inexcusable that we have homeless people to the extent that we do. It's inexcusable that we have such a high unemployment rate in normal times. I mean, I'm not talking about COVID, which exacerbated pre-existing conditions. When people feel, I'm trying to say, that they have no hope, that their children have no hope, that their grandchildren have no hope, then they look for scapegoats. And what's a scapegoat look like? It looks like a person of African descent historically in this country. Our people have been scapegoated since slavery. And a whole mythology and a superstructure was constructed in order to justify our enslavement. And then when our enslavement ended, and then we had that brief moment of freedom, it was called upon again in a more heinous and cynical way, because the genie was out of the lantern, and the genie had to be put back out of the lamp, and the genie had to be put back in the lamp again, to mix my metaphors, and I apologize for that. But that is what we are seeing today, a rollback of Reconstruction. The analog is affirmative action. That was the introduction of a new Reconstruction, the second Reconstruction. More Black people in the middle class, more Black people leave the inner cities, move to the suburbs. Look at the number of Black people elected to the Congress, in the highest number ever. And that produced the threats of economic insecurity, which had to be explained away. People were getting things unfairly. People were getting things they didn't deserve. Black people were being admitted over more qualified white people or more recently Asian people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's all traced back to economic insecurity. So the most fundamental way to address that is to radically revise our public education system, because that is the key to economic prosperity. It has been for every immigrant group in the United States, and it's true for economically disenfranchised, as it were, white people, and it's true for Black people today as well.
You know, speaking of education, I wanted to shift a little bit and talk about higher education, because actually in your book, you do acknowledge that some of our institutions of higher education were, in the area of scientific racism, were involved in some of these studies that helped forward this propaganda. And I wondered if you could reflect a little bit on being a Harvard professor with an anti-racist project through the work that you do, but knowing that your institution has this history. And we grapple with that kind of thing here at UNC, and many institutions do across the country. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, you're referring to Louis Agassiz. Louis Agassiz, excuse me.
Of course, I'm an anthropologist, so all of these studies, you know, well familiar
Right.
to us. Yeah.
Yeah, and I have a chapter in the book about the uses of scientific racism, and it's something I'm very concerned about. I'm so sorry. When I was, I took a course my sophomore year, and it was about the Harlem Renaissance. And James Weldon Johnson, who wrote "Lift Every Voice and Sing," as you know, was a great Black poet, the first Black executive director of the NAACP. He wrote this paragraph in which he said that a people that it's demonstrated its greatness through literature and art has never been judged inferior. And I thought that was such an arbitrary thing, even when I was 19 years old. So when I went to Cambridge and decided that I was going to write a PhD, they wouldn't let me write about Black literature because they told me Black literature didn't exist. This is 1973. I mean, seriously, they said, Black literature, what are you talking about? But they did let me write about ideas of race and reason in the Enlightenment. And I traced this idea back from 1922 when James Weldon Johnson wrote it, back to the Enlightenment, to the 18th century. And the idea, the roots of the idea were these, that Africans, people of African descent, were by nature inferior intellectually to the other varieties of man, quote unquote, in the world on the great chain of being. Now, students, great chain of being, imagine a staircase. Imagine an infinite staircase with God at the top, and on the second rung are angels, and then there's a human community with Europeans, people from China, Asians, people from the subcontinent, that'd be the third rung of the human subsection, Native Americans, and then the fifth rung in the human cross-section would be Africans. What are under Africans? Apes. And there are many Europeans who argued about whether Africans were more related to apes or to the other four branches of the human community. It sounds like I'm being hyperbolic. It sounds like I'm exaggerating, but it is absolutely the case. And it is the dark side of the Enlightenment. David Hume, writing in Of National Characters in 1754, said that, and you could look all over the African continent and never had one Black person created. He said, and I quote, "No arts, no sciences." 10 years later, in section 4 of his Observations on the Feeling of the Sublime, Immanuel Kant, riffing on David Hume, said the same thing and made it worse. He quoted a Black man who said something about male-female relations. And then he said, it was obvious that what this man said was stupid because he was Black from head to foot. There is a conflation between characteristics, skin color, and character, inner nature, meaning stupidity. That's Immanuel Kant, the man who wrote The Critique of Pure Reason. Thomas Jefferson, one of the two figures of the American Enlightenment, with Benjamin Franklin. How did he feel? He said Phyllis Wheatley's poems were beneath the dignity of criticism, and he doubted whether that she wrote them herself or that Benjamin Banneker, the first Black person to make an almanac, and he had built a clock, whether he had done his mathematical calculations on his own. Hegel in the 1830s says Africans have no history. They have no history because they cannot write. There is no indigenous system of writing. And if you have no system of writing, you have no memory. Now we jump from Hegel in the 1830s to Louis Agassiz here at Harvard. He's Swiss. He believes, he's very anti-Darwin. He believes in polygenesis, meaning that there wasn't a proverbial one Adam and Eve, right? That the human community, I mean, he would have died, oh my God, if he had known that the human community evolved out of East Africa, he would have shot himself. And he wrote a letter to his mother about being served by a Black man, a waiter. And basically he said, it seemed as if the man's arms are getting longer, like those of an ape, you know, even as he stood next to him. And that is not an exact quotation, but it's even worse if you look up the letter. And so I'm saying that this discourse, that pseudoscience, this discourse of so-called scientific racism, really has its roots in the Enlightenment, when what we call natural philosophy or natural history, when there was tremendous speculation about the nature of the human community, precisely as Europe was discovering other worlds of color. And people were trying to systematize the scale of nature, as it was called. And we, meaning people of African descent, were treated in a racist way even then. And this is before the birth of white supremacy. Last week, I traced the etymology of the phrase white supremacy. And I thought it was, remember, I'm born in 1950. So the first time I heard about it was with George Wallace and Orville Faubus and, you know, all these horrible racists in the late 50s and early 60s. But the first usage, according to Merriam-Webster, was 1824. And it was used in terms of controlling enslaved people on the island of Jamaica, and they vastly outnumbered the white people. So that ideology of white supremacy goes back, you know, to slavery, the early 19th century. But the pseudoscience that would make us be inferior by nature or by God, and they, in this sense, nature with a capital N and God are substitutable terms, that goes back to the Enlightenment, the time when we're throwing off superstition. We're throwing off myths, the idea that the world's 5,300 years old, or the world was created in 7 days, or, you know, or whatever. Precisely when we're doing so much to underscore the primacy of reason. You know, Descartes says in the 17th century, I think, therefore I am. That then is used to say they don't think, therefore they are not. They lack reason, therefore they are not human, and therefore we can enslave them and use their free labor to create the world's greatest civilization in history. You see, these ideas, the history of ideas, the history of science, the history of philosophy, the history of literature, the history of art, and economics are all inextricably intertwined. It's a proverbial ball of wax, or the dangling string on a sweater, and you start to pull it. I started to pull it when I was 19 years old. Why would James Weldon Johnson say a people who would produce great literature and art will never be judged inferior? It seems so arbitrary to me. He said it because they were still fighting that war of representation, the war against the people who cast aspersions on the nature of the African or the person of African descent. If nature gives you less of an IQ as a whole race of people than say white people or Chinese people or any other, or Indians from the subcontinent, then there's nothing you could do. If it's genetic, save your money from all those Head Start programs. I don't even know if they use the term Head Start programs, but my day, that's what they were called. All of those ways that we can help people to get higher scores on their SATs or their ACTs, or to learn the ABCs before you get to kindergarten. My brother and I could read and write long before we started first grade because our mother was a genius and sat with us all day and made us watch those programs that were forerunners of Sesame Street. For us, it was Ding Dong School and another one. I can't think of it right now. But these were we got magazines, subscriptions, we got books, Reader's Digest condensed books. Our parents read to us. We had a very stable family. Our father worked 2 jobs, so we had more money than even any of the other Black people. We were all poor and working class, but it was all relative. But we were raised in a very secure environment with our own bedrooms and our own dictionaries, new clothes, new textbooks. No one ever told us that we were inferior, that we were less than. But that's what the pseudosciences of headed by Louis Agassiz and the theories of polygenesis, that there were multiple atoms. That's what it was all designed to do. It was designed to say, these people, and it goes back to that Thomas Dixon quote that I read, these people are savages. They are beasts. They are ape-like. Look at those caricatures in the book or in the film. So often we're represented as simian, in some simian way, as a monkey, related to monkeys more than we were related to Europeans. We were biologically different, and you can't change biology. So they're meant to either be slaves, and then if you decide, well, that's immoral, then they're meant to be subservient and to do menial tasks. But they're not meant to be a professor at the University of North Carolina. They're not meant to be at Harvard. They're not meant to be doctors or lawyers or accountants or whatever it is. They're meant to serve us. So that the ideology of white supremacy was aided even by well-meaning people who were well-trained with college degrees, but who were caught in the web of anti-Black racism, just like the worst apologists for the Confederacy after the end of the Civil War.
We're going to shift now. The time goes by so quickly. There's so much to talk about.
I don't want to shift. I want to keep talking to you.
Well, we've got a whole bunch of people who are putting in questions in the Q&A. So I want to give them a little bit of a chance as well.
Can I ask you one thing, Professor? I want to just say one thing.
Yes.
And I brought this quote for you and for the audience, just to show how mean the propaganda war against Black people was in the rollback to Reconstruction. Reconstruction again is 1865, 1877. The rollback to Reconstruction is called redemption, and as one of the historians in the film said in the clip, because they were redeeming the South. The woman who was the genius in the Lost Cause campaign, that's what it was called, the Lost Cause, was the historian general of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. And her name was Mildred Lewis Rutherford. And last year I made my graduate students in my English department seminar read a book that she published called The Measuring Rod. And she wrote this pamphlet and sent it to virtually every library she could and anybody who was teaching the history of the Civil War. And this is what and it had these 20 principles. And it told you what to reject. And any interpretation that conformed to what I'm about to read should be rejected as being a lie or historically inaccurate. And I want you to listen to this list. Reject a book that says the South fought the Civil War to hold her slaves. Reject a book that speaks of the slaveholder of the South as cruel and unjust. It's so hard for me to read this because it cracks me up. Reject a book that glorifies Abraham Lincoln. I mean, this was the measuring rod. And this was used in order to reinterpret both the Civil War and the history of slavery, as well as the 12-year Reconstruction period. So that, as Brian Stevenson said, the South lost the war on the battlefield, but it won the war of interpretation about what the Civil War was all about. And they were able to do it because within 50 years, when they had reenactments, say, of Gettysburg, the Battle of Gettysburg in 1913, the North, the veterans still living, the North and the South, restaged a charge. They get to the middle of the battlefield, they throw their guns down, hug each other and cry, and basically say, how could we have killed each other over those Negroes? How could we have killed each other? And word Negro is what they would have used then, of course. How could we have sacrificed 750,000 American lives to free these people? And by 1913, nobody could remember. By 1913, the North and the South were united in the fact that, in the belief that Reconstruction was a problem because these Black people were given too much power. They were freed too quickly, and they were given too much power too quickly, which they weren't able to control, like giving the child the keys to a car, letting them think that they could run legislatures and be in Congress and make laws. So that our battle has been economic, political, as well as semiotic, meaning a battle of imagery. Okay. What do you see? My colleague Barbara Johnson defined a stereotype as an already read text. That is such a subtle, brilliant definition. I'm going to repeat it. That a stereotype is an already read text. That means if you look up and you see a Black person, you immediately categorize them as possessing attributes X, Y, and Z, and not possessing attributes A, B, and C. Like you're a criminal, you know, or the Trayvon Martin, or I mean, I don't want to even get in the list of people who've been victims of either racist, because you're jogging through a white neighborhood and two lunatics assassinate you, or the police, you shoot somebody 7 times in the back, or you put your knee on somebody and choke the life out of them. Why? Because in your mind, they're not a human being like you're a human being. They are a being that is different, and killing them is not the same as killing a real human being or a human being like you. So we have a lot of work as a society to do in order to fight this upsurge of white supremacy. And it's not as easy as just voting out of office a person who, at the least, one could say, manipulated the tropes of white supremacy to his advantage and would have done so gleefully if that could have gotten him another 7 million votes or 8 million votes, he could have stayed in the White House. Now, I'm sorry, but I had to read that because I wanted the students, particularly at UNC, to know that to send out a book about what was a proper interpretation of the Civil War in order to control the narrative, that is how detailed the rollback of Reconstruction was, and the rise of white supremacy was built upon that multifaceted plan of attack.
Right, right. Well, we do have a couple of questions here that I'll mix together. We just have about 5 minutes, but somewhat coming off of what you've just said, the two questions have something to do with, and what do we do now? And how do we guard against this? And one person specifically asked if you believe that reparations is an answer for the legacy of Jim Crow and what the white supremacist ideology coming out of the Reconstruction era.
I believe in, I believe that affirmative action is a form of reparations.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that healthcare for all is a form of reparations. I believe that a guaranteed income is a form of reparations, but I would do it for everybody. There are some things that I would make race specific because Black people have suffered disproportionately from slavery and anti-Black racism. So affirmative action programs, for example, that's the form. And then other programs I would make more class-based because poverty is colorblind, right? And the effects of poverty, you know, I grew up in West Virginia, and I know that certain patterns of behavior that are tied to not having enough money are replicated by, no matter what color you are, right? You can have forms of pain and distress and the limitations of intellectual development. If you don't have the right diet, it doesn't matter if you're Black or white. So I don't think that, particularly now with the economy the way that it is, you notice Barack Obama never mentioned the word reparation, right? It's not exactly as if this is going to be ever voted upon by a House of Representatives or a Senate, or if you took a look at polls of the American people, are they for reparations? Overwhelmingly not. The white community and the Black community overwhelmingly is. So you'd have I don't see how we could even get to race-based reparations, even if we can justify them. Would I say they would be justified? Of course. You know, you can't put, Black people came to Florida in 1526, not 1619, folks. We got to North America in 1526 in Florida. Our people were here almost 100 years before the 20 Black people from Angola floated down the James River in Virginia. You can't have all those years between 1526 and 1865 with 90% of a group of people in slavery, because 10% of the Black community after the censuses, after 1830, there was always about 10 to 12% of the Black community that was free, and 90% in slavery. Until the Civil War, till the Emancipation Proclamation, then 500,000 people run away, you know, behind Union lines, and they're free, and then everybody's freed by the 13th Amendment. You can't have a people systematically discriminated against, enslaved, defined as property for all those hundreds of years, and followed by a century of Jim Crow without it having an effect. It's just, it boggles the mind that anybody would even question that. And do we need race-based solutions? Yes, of course we do. Affirmative action is just one. But we also need to address the causes of economic inequality, because poverty affects everybody. The curtailment of opportunity affects everybody. And we're only going to have more Proud Boys. We're only going to have more outrage, more attempted coups, more insurrections like January 6th, unless we speak to the economic pain that all poor people are feeling. So that on the one hand, we have to acknowledge the historically specific ways that Black people have suffered. On the other hand, we have to speak across the board to the economic ways that all Americans are suffering. Am I making sense? You see what I'm saying? We have to be compassionate. We have to, it's not like We have never had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission in America like they did in South Africa. And we probably never will, but we should have. And saying that we deserve reparations, we deserve to be repaired for the race-specific, slave-specific, Jim Crow-specific ways that pain and harm were inflicted upon us is a good, healthy contribution to racial healing in this society. But we can't have only economic policies that speak to Black poverty. We just can't. We have to speak to poverty across the board through reform of public education, access to health care, guaranteed minimum wage, a guaranteed job, et cetera, et cetera. We have to do it, otherwise we're going to create even more animosity between, that's going to be racialized. We're going to make white supremacy worse.
Well, of course, the reparations topic could be a webinar in and of itself, and actually it is. Wish we had more time, but we are actually out of time. As I said, the time goes by so quickly because there's so much to discuss. But Professor Gates, Skip, I do want to thank you for joining us this evening. It's been a pleasure to have a conversation with you. I'd also like to thank Chancellor Guskowitz and Benita Ramsey, who has been assisting with the Q&A during the session. We also want to, of course, thank the Frey Foundation and the College of Arts and Sciences for making this event possible. And thank you also to our production crew today. And lastly, but not least, thank you to the audience for joining us, and everybody have a good evening.
Thank you. You're an excellent, excellent host. Thank you. I had such a good time.
Thank you so much.
So I'll see you at Crook's Corner, right?
Absolutely. After COVID.
Good night.